Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. Hopefully everybody is feeling invigorated after a little fresh air, some time in the cold, a little unexpected hiccup, I guess, for all our conference organizers. So happy that we're back and ready for this upcoming session. I will begin by acknowledging that the City of Halifax is situated in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. We have 3 presentations in the session. Our Q&A period, as with other sessions, will take place after the 3rd presentation. First, today we'll hear from Nick Kerman. His presentation is titled Managing Risky Behaviors and Challenges to Prevent Housing Loss in Permanent Supportive Housing. Welcome, Nick.
I should have done. Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here to share some ongoing research that we've been doing looking at risk management in the context of permanent supportive housing and housing first programs with the goal of preventing housing loss and recurrent homelessness. Just to start off with some background and acknowledgement of some collaborators, there's many investigators that are contributing to this project in some form, 4 of whom, by my count, are in the room today, and they love to be singled out. So that includes Dr. Tim Aubry, Dr. Sean Kidd, Dr. John Sylvester, and Dr. Christina Muchler, and they're joined by a number of other researchers throughout the province as well. Funding for the project is via Infrastructure Canada, and there are I have no conflicts of interest to report here. So to start off with, we recognize that permanent supportive housing is a best practice intervention for stably housing 80 to 90% of people experiencing chronic homelessness and mental illness, with numerous trials demonstrating that housing stability outcomes persist for up to about 6 years, 6 years just being the end of the follow-up in some of those trials. And what that also means is there's a smaller group, about 10 to 20% of people who have some difficulties in housing first and permanent supportive housing programs and may go on to be at risk of eviction, recurrent homelessness, relocation, not by choice, and rehospitalization. And there's been a sizable amount of research in the past decade that's tried to understand who are those 10 to 20%. And while that research has demonstrated some small correlations, like around severity of substance use problems, the conclusions have always been the same. We can't reliably predict who is going to succeed in permanent housing, permanent supportive housing and housing first, and who may go on to experience difficulties. At the same time, what that research hasn't really looked at is the role of high-risk behaviors and high-risk issues. And whether or not that increases risk for housing loss. And that's where this research comes in. And so when I say high-risk behaviors and challenges, I'm really referring to the ones that are on the slide here. So this would include risks to self, overdose, suicidality, non-suicidal self-injury, falls-related injuries, as well as this more dynamic, kind of eclectic group of risks to others, risks to building. This would include things like fires, intentional or unintentional, floods, other forms of property damage, hoarding, apartment takeovers, unwanted guests, trespassing, violence, whether that's physical or sexual violence, drug selling, and human trafficking. We included human trafficking in, and at this point in the research, having talked with numerous providers time and time again, we've simply heard human trafficking is not a risk issue that we're facing. So we've included it. I won't talk further about it because it really isn't as applicable as a number of these other ones, and I'm already seeing some shaking heads as well. So that's validation of what we've been hearing and our own active listening. That said, we know that a number of these other high-risk issues are prevalent among individuals living in permanent supportive housing and housing first programs. This was a study that was done a couple years ago by one of our collaborators on the project, Frank Siritich at CMHA Toronto, that looked at about 12,000 applicants to supportive housing in Toronto and found that 1 out of 5 had a history of suicide attempts, about 18% were engaged in, had a history of physical assault. One of our collaborators collaborators on the project pointed out that it's not actually clear if that's perpetuation or victimization. Chances are it's a bit of both in that one. Non-suicidal self-injury was 15%, fire safety concerns 8%, property damage 8%, and hoarding 6%. And I just want to flag hoarding for a second. Because at the same time, there was research that was done in Texas with veterans experiencing homelessness that had a more rigorous assessment of hoarding behaviors among veterans entering supportive housing, and they found clinically disordered hoarding to be a prevalence of 18%, which is about 3 times higher there. And why I just bring that up is, we're going to talk more about hoarding in just a moment. There may not be sufficient information at the point of application on hoarding histories, and that enable providers to plan accordingly to address this potential problem that applicants may face. So there might be kind of an informational gap that programs are seeing here that might account for this wide variation between 2 different studies at the same time. Our study set out to do a few things. We wanted to really identify promising approaches to managing those high-risk issues in the context of supportive housing with a focus on person-centered ones that are beneficial for preventing housing loss. And then we also wanted to better understand what are some of the barriers and facilitators to doing that. And that's what I'll tell you a little bit about some of our preliminary findings on today. It's a multi-methods mixed methods study with 3 components largely, all of which have built on each other. So we started with a rapid review of the literature to understand what are the approaches that have been documented around preventing and responding to high-risk issues and behaviors. We then revised our interviews with providers from across the country, some of whom may be in the room today, and if that's the case, thank you for taking part. We concluded that component of the research this week, and we've launched an online survey that's still active, and I'm going to put in a plug for that at the end today. Just out of curiosity, how many people here work in supportive housing programs or housing first programs? Oh boy, I have a survey for you. We'll come back to that in just a second. But to start off with the rapid review. So we wanted to understand in the literature and the research that's been conducted, what impacts do high-risk behaviors and challenges have on housing tenancies, housing sustainability in the context of permanent supportive housing and housing first? And then we wanted to document all those different approaches that were used. We included all of those risk issues that were in that previous slide, but we were also open to the prospect of additional risk issues with which we weren't familiar, and so we defined it as any critical events or serious behaviors that were potentially life-threatening or had the potential to jeopardize housing tenures. I won't get into the methodologies, that's presented there. The article's available online. We also have a plain language summary that folks can check out as well. We went through it, we ended up with 32 papers that we took a look at. And on that first question, what impacts do high-risk issues have on housing-related outcomes? What we found is there hasn't been a lot of research in this area. 2 studies looked at housing first programs and found that overdose was a leading cause of death in those programs. Of note, one study was from France, another was from Philadelphia, and both would correspond with kind of a time period where we haven't seen quite the drug supply that we know to exist now in Canada. And so what that really means is this could be a growing issue with regards to, in the context of housing first programs and supportive housing. With regards to some of the other factors, there was one study that looked at greater hostility, finding a small but significant correlation that it led to increased likelihood of leaving a single site housing first program for people with severe alcohol use disorders. It was fairly negligible, all things considered, in terms of practical impact. Some of the other risk issues that have been identified all found no effects on permanent supportive housing exit. What this really meant was, for us at this point, we felt there was insufficient evidence to conclude that these high-risk issues do affect housing tenure, although overdose is certainly a serious concern and a potentially growing one, and we'll come back to that in just a second. The other aspect of the review is we wanted to look at how are those high-risk issues managed? How are they addressed by teams? And we took all of the approaches and then we tried to categorize them. And we came up with these 8. In doing a run through of the presentation, this is where I can spend way too much time. So I'm not going to go into all of them. We have resources to read more about them. But what this really showed us is that there's a real range of ways that programs can respond to risk. Most of these are actions that organizations and programs take, although sometimes this would include actions that tenants and residents themselves can take. So things like self-defense, which was found in a study in the US around firearm possession because people felt unsafe in the context of the program in their housing. I'm not going to talk much more about that, but I also just want to point out the extent to which these are person-centered probably vary, right? Some are more choice-enabling, others might be a little bit more controlling, surveillant, monitoring, and so we can start to see some flexibility that can emerge here with regards to the different approaches that could be person-centered and some that might not be as person-centered. Getting into what we then heard from service providers. So we've interviewed 32 service providers in permanent supportive housing and housing first programs across the country. And here are some barriers, and I'll just speak to a couple here. One is really focused on the role of the organization, the separation or non-separation of housing and supports. And so when the organization is the landlord, there can be that dual role of is the case manager supporting somebody clinically, or are they supporting somebody from a landlord perspective? Wally Che actually used the term this morning to refer to this dual role as a mini landlord role. And I like that just in terms of making it really difficult to separate at times, and that potentially affecting the bond and the trust between staff and residents. One of the more, one of the more topical concerns that was raised by a number of providers was what they saw with some private market landlords that were starting to use risk issues as an out. In that we don't really want to continue with your program, and this property damage is kind of the last straw. And this is a concern not only for the implications around eviction of the individual, but also sustainability of that unit as an affordable housing unit in the context of a Housing First program. And so being able to also see some of these barriers are not just for residents and teams, but also to organizations who are accessing that unit. No phones or call buttons in unit was a huge one. We heard time and time again the challenge that creates for programs and for residents and their capacity to initiate actions to respond to potential risk issues, whether that's suicidality, overdose, or some sort of other gender-based violence, for example. Facilitators, going the other way. I just want to highlight again a couple of them, and this is kind of the other side of the coin with organization as landlord. It worked in beneficial ways at times with other types of risk issues, because what it also allowed programs to do was consider more options potentially than a private market landlord might in some cases before reaching an eviction decision, but it also enabled some providers to use loopholes that would be created through subleases, for example, to go in when there is an apartment takeover or unwanted guests and immediately remove those individuals, as opposed to having to wait for the tenant to bring that forward. And providers talked about there are a lot of barriers to residents doing just that. Community partnerships, very self-explanatory. The more we heard about the importance of a diversity of community partnerships with mental health agencies, fire departments, police, all these sorts of different first responders and other clinical supports that can be assets to risk management at various points. And then we've heard about some really, really promising person-centered approaches. And this is data that we continue to analyze. I just wanted to highlight a few. And the first one that I think is just so important to bring forward is a couple interviews from some prairie providers that really knocked me on my butt. They looked at that list of risk issues on that earlier slide, and they looked at me and said, none of those are problems for us. And if you're a qualitative researcher and somebody says that with that much confidence, you are excited to ask the next question. Why? Tell me more. And what both of those individuals at different agencies said is, we don't look at those risk issues as the problem. We look at those as the symptom of a problem. And those symptoms are resulting from a lack of safety. And it's not just a lack of safety right now, because there's this history of individuals having this lack of safety, the trauma they've experienced, the structural violence they've experienced, and these risk behaviors actually may be necessary adaptive responses to that has persisted in the context of supportive housing. And so now, by seeing these as the symptoms, we can ask a different question. What do you need to feel safer? And that's a really interesting shift, as opposed to how can we get rid of or deal with this hoarding situation right here, right now. It's a much different kind of upstream question, and also recognizing that the shift from living in the streets or in a shelter that may be chaotic to a calmer supportive housing environment is an adjustment that can be destabilizing for people. And so really, how do you also create buffer space where people can go through those adjustment bumps along the way, and then at the end of it, staff are there to say, we're still here with you, we're working with you, you're not evicted, and giving that almost corrective experience or alternative experience to one that people may not have had previously. Use of ethical decision-making frameworks for exploring intervention options was another kind of really low resource, easy to implement practice that a number of organizations described when dealing with some of these risk issues, that involved identifying what are all of the options that we could consider, and how does that align with our organizational mandate, our program mandate, and our own provider values. And having that and holding space for that, because there may be tension there. There may be misalignment, and at the same time, eviction may be on the table despite a mandate to end homelessness, and really being able to acknowledge that and use that to maybe explore, is this the right path, and what are the benefits and drawbacks, as well as how can we maybe take steps to prevent something similar from happening next time. Mobile managed alcohol programs. I didn't really know much about this before starting the research. These are awesome. I'm not going to say more about that than that. They're just very innovative ways to adapt a evidence-based intervention in MAPS to be provided in a scattered site model. And what those providers that worked there said, there was a reduction in violence from non-beverage alcohol consumption that they saw in the program. And then last but not least, specialist roles. So really roles on support teams that take the intensive case management approach and then add something so that different team members have this specialization. And so one of the programs we talked with had, a set of case managers, one of whom was a hoarding specialist, one of whom was an addiction specialist, one of whom was a landlord liaison specialist, one of which was a trauma specialist. And what they did is they didn't necessarily provide intensive long-term support in those clinical areas, but they became a bridge, because one of the barriers we heard about is that emergent risk issues, there's not necessarily supports immediately available, and those risk issues escalate. And then it really hits a crisis point, and they haven't been able to access services. What these specialist roles start to do is become a little bit of an internal capacity bridge that we heard about. So last but not least, learnings to date, there are really, from what we can tell, there are 8 types of approaches to managing risk and supportive housing that have the potential, some of which to be more controlling, some of which are more person-centered. We don't know the extent to which they are effective, but we also recognize that they are being used in response to complex dynamic problems, and so it's hard to kind of compare one against each other given the diversity of situations. Going back to that rapid review finding, we said that we can't really conclude that high-risk issues are impacting housing outcomes and housing stability. However, overwhelmingly in the interviews, we heard from providers that it is the risks to building and others that is a serious threat to housing stability. It is not risks to self. Overwhelmingly, providers said, yep, we can deal with that, we can support people through it. It is the risks to building and others that we're struggling with, or that does pose a concern for housing outcomes of residents. This is from the survey that we've just launched. We're asking providers about how their programs, how effective they perceive their programs' approaches are with those different risk issues. What we are seeing, hoarding and drug selling are the two areas where most providers, feel that their programs are least effective out of all of those risk issues that we identified earlier. And with that said, I'm just going to end with a plug. This is a survey that is currently live. We are trying to reach as many supportive housing and housing first providers as we can across the country. Takes 20 minutes to complete. People get a $10 Amazon.ca voucher or can make a donation of $10 to charity. I have flyers. Come see me. Thank you. And if anyone else is interested in the research, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick, for an excellent presentation. We'll now move on to our second presenter. Joining us will be Christina Mutchler. Dr. Mutchler is a clinical psychologist and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa, where she examines initiatives that promote inclusion for individuals who have experienced severe mental health and homelessness. This presentation is titled Outcomes of Housing First Implemented, did I get that right? In a Rural Canadian Community. Perfect. Sorry, I just thought I might have read the wrong line. Let's get your presentation up here. Where is our slideshow?
And then if you do presenter view if possible. Oh yeah, it should come up right.
There we go.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today after a very long and informative day. My name is Christina Mutchler, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa, working with Dr. Tim Aubry, who's also here with us today. And I'm going to be talking about a mixed methods analysis of outcomes of a Housing First program implemented in a rural Canadian community. Just an outline of my presentation today. I'm going to talk about the context of rural homelessness. I'll provide an overview of Housing First, also research, the limited research on rural Housing First programs, and then talk about our program, which was implemented in southeast New Brunswick. So, rural homelessness is often hidden and invisible. Individuals who experience homelessness in rural areas often rely on temporary or unsustainable shelters. So, for example, they might rely on family members' housing, they may do some couch surfing, and so because of that, they're very hard to locate. So we don't see them in the same way that we might see individuals who experience homelessness in more urban communities. There is also a more prevalent lack of housing and lack of services, which can be a major contributing factor to homelessness because there just isn't those same access that we would see in a more urban center. So because we're not able to locate folks who experience homelessness in rural areas, there's also a lack of research on this population and the interventions that we can use to best address it. So today I'm going to be talking about research on the pathways model of Housing First, or very close variants of it. I expect that most of you are quite familiar with the Housing First approach. So the pathways model assists to move people immediately into scattered site housing by providing them with rent assistance and intensive community support. In terms of housing, individuals who access these Housing First programs, there's no requirements for readiness for housing. So there doesn't need to be any sort of stability with mental health or substance use problems. And 30% of their income goes to rent, and then the rest is supplemented by the program. The intensive support that is delivered is typically in the form of assertive community treatment. Sorry, I lost my marker here. There we go. Or intensive case management. And the housing that is offered can be in private market housing or in social housing. So many of you are probably familiar with the at-home chez soi study completed in Canada across 5 Canadian cities. So this is just a brief overview of those 5 cities and the results of these studies. So you'll see these graphs that show each of the Canadian cities and the housing stability, which does not differ much across the sites. On the y-axis is the percentage of time spent in stable housing, and the x-axis is the number of months spent in the study. The red line represents participants receiving the Housing First intervention, and the blue line underneath represents participants receiving treatment as usual. Gaps in all of the cities between Housing First and treatment as usual show how effective these interventions were at increasing housing stability over time. However, you'll note that the populations across these cities, the lowest being Moncton at 107,000, still represent quite a urban area. There are very few programs or published studies that have been completed on the effectiveness of Housing First in rural settings. One of these programs that has been studied is the Pathways Vermont program, which was implemented in Vermont, which is quite a rural state. This program started in 2009, and it adapted Housing First for a rural population. There was partnerships with corrections, mental health, veteran affairs, and includes a Housing First model with rapid rehousing, community peer support, and a training institute. At Pathways Vermont, their population served was 100% had a mental health diagnosis, and 68% had substance use problems. Over 90% of the population served had experienced trauma. The results of this study found that for 640 people, chronic homelessness was ended with a housing retention rate of 87%. The program also supported 150 people leaving prison, and 81% had not returned to being incarcerated. So this is one of the very few studies that had been conducted to date examining the rural outcomes of a Housing First program. The purpose of the current study was to examine both quantitative and qualitative outcomes of Housing First tenants in the rural arm of the at-home chez soi study, which was conducted between 2009 and 2013. So as I previously mentioned, the Moncton site of the at-home chez soi study had the lowest population. And in that arm of the study, there was also a particular pilot project that was conducted in southeast New Brunswick. So the study involved housing first plus assertive community treatment delivered to people with high or moderate level needs. And in the rural arm, there was 24 participants who were offered housing first that were matched with 19 participants receiving treatment as usual. So this particular part of the study was not a randomized controlled design. However, it was conducted so that we could see differences across these two semi-equivalent groups. So just the context of the southeast region of New Brunswick. It's a 60-minute drive from Moncton and encompasses 2,000 square kilometers. The municipalities range in population from a few hundred people all the way to 5,000, and the overall population is around 40,000 people. So it's quite a rural and quite large area. The housing that was provided was permanent scattered site housing in the private market, where 30% of the tenants' income went towards their rent. The tenants held their own lease, and they were also connected to a housing worker who got them set up with their home. There was also the ACT team provided, which gave, there was 3 individuals dedicated to the rural region, and each tenant had a primary and secondary case manager, as well as assistance from the urban staff when needed, and teleconferencing to meetings with the urban center. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context on both the housing first and the treatment as usual groups. Remember at the beginning of my talk, I talked about how rural homelessness typically looks different than what we see in more urban centers. And this is really showcased here in this table, where we had 42% of the sample living with family across both groups. We had 48% of the treatment as usual group living in a special care home versus 21% of the housing first group. And then notably, we had 21% of the housing first group precariously housed and 12% identified as being absolutely homeless. This is also different from the other sites of the At-Home Chez Soi study, where in order to, as an inclusion criteria, you either had to be absolutely homeless or precariously housed. So because homelessness looks different in rural settings, we included these individuals as well into the study. There was also a significant difference between the two groups in lifetime, time and months spent homeless, as well as longest period of homelessness, with the housing first group having more time spent homelessness and a longest period of being homeless. So although we had, this matched sample, there were significant differences between the two groups at baseline. So in terms of our outcomes, this graph here and then the table below represents the percentage of time stably housed. And what we found was that across the 18-month period, there was no significant difference between the housing first group and the treatment as usual group in their housing status. And for the majority of the study, they were 100% housed, and then at 18 months that went down to 86%. So overall, a very successful rate of housing for the housing first group, who had a much higher level of lifetime homelessness and being precariously housed. In terms of psychosocial outcomes, there was no significant differences found between the two groups on our primary outcomes, the Multnomah Community Ability Scale, quality of life, and community integration. Although we didn't find this in the quantitative outcomes, I also want to talk about our qualitative outcomes because these were very small sample sizes with treatment groups that weren't necessarily completely similar. So I want to talk a little bit about what folks in the Housing First group said about their intervention. So 11 interviews were conducted with Housing First clients, and they endorsed satisfaction with the housing subsidy they received, as well as mental health support they received. And they also talked a lot about the changes that they experienced because of the program, which I'll go into detail about. And then lastly, they noted a continued need for connection and meaningful activity. In terms of the housing subsidy, participants endorsed that the financial assistance that the program gave them had a significant impact on their lives. So one participant said the most helpful is helping the person find a place and paying 30% of the rent. Another said, I've been able to save money and put a down payment on the house. They pay $400 and that's our mortgage. Lastly, that's an important number one. I think if I hadn't had the financial help from the project, I would have lost my home. Participants also discussed that the mental health support they received had a significant impact on their well-being. The project means that you meet people who are trying to help you and understand you, and I feel that I have the support of a lot of people. So because of this support that they received, there was also some additional outcomes that folks talked about in their interviews. One being increased autonomy. So participants talked about that the Housing First program allowed them to be more autonomous across numerous life domains. One person said, I have a place to live. I've learned how to make my own groceries. I've learned to pay my bills myself. I used to have a phobia about doing all that stuff. Now I do it all. Another said, I feel I can still be in control of myself even when I'm thinking negative thoughts. And the reason I say that is because of the system I'm using. I don't let the negative discourage me because I remember what it was like before and what it's like now, and it works. One thing that came up in the qualitative outcomes was a need for meaningful connection and activity. So participants talked about the importance of engaging in activities and connecting with others, and this was often discussed as a need that people had. There was a lack of connection and resources that people had access to because they were in a rural area. And I just wanted to note the positive that people had when they did engage, with one client saying, I had the chance to work on a farm as part of the project, and I really liked that job. Now I think I'm going to continue. I was looking for work in that field before, but when I got the chance through the project, well, I wanted to go, so it helped me find a job that I like. Although we found numerous qualitative outcomes, and importantly, quantitatively, that individuals sustained their housing tenancies, there were a number of difficulties with implementing Housing First in a rural area. First of all, being a rural area, there's just fewer choice in housing options. And an important tenet of Housing First is that folks have a say in where they want to live. And sometimes that wasn't able to be done just because of the lack of choice. There was also sometimes the support that was offered wasn't intense enough for some of the clients. Having limited access to like a connection to the community, other community resources weren't available, and so they often had to rely solely on their caseworkers, which sometimes wasn't enough for what that person needed. Like I said, limited community resources, less opportunities for leisure and social activities. Tenants also talked about discrimination linked to knowledge of client history. So as you can imagine, living in a rural area, living in a small town, everybody knows everybody's business. So if somebody that, in your town has a history of mental health or homelessness or substance use problems, unfortunately that information had spread in that community. And so then when that tenant was interested in engaging or being a member of the community, they were often met with discrimination and stigma and then weren't able to participate in the way that they wanted to. In terms of the implementation challenges for staff, the travel was very time consuming for the case managers who had to be all over this rural area keeping track of clients. And then when a staff person was sick or had to be absent, it was often difficult to have somebody else cover when you might be, driving an hour to get to another client's place. So the present study indicated that Housing First can be implemented successfully into a rural community. Although there weren't any statistically significant differences, these two samples were also not equivalent at baseline. And our qualitative interviews endorsed numerous positive outcomes from clients who are in this program. There is such a lack of research in rural areas due to the problems I noted before of being unable to identify individuals who are experiencing homelessness in rural areas. And more research is needed to better understand the outcomes of Housing First programs in rural settings. Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Oh, perfect. Okay. And you wanted to have this. Thank you. We'll see if we can move all the cords. Our third presentation this afternoon is titled The Next Step, Supporting Your Client's Self-Autonomy, which will be presented by Sheila Woodhouse. Sheila Woodhouse is the Executive Director of the Nazareth Community, and she's held this role for 12 years. She's joined by a couple members of her team for this presentation, Jennifer Willard and Eric Feliciano. Welcome.
Ready to roll? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for including the Nazareth Community Project in this lecture series. With so many concurrent topics going on all at the same time, we really appreciate you being here, and to the people who are on Zoom. So my name is Sheila Woodhouse, thank you. I am the ED of Nazareth Community. This is a non-for-profit organization in downtown Montreal. We are non-denominational and we're trans-welcoming, and I have to interject now, we've just changed our name to be much more inclusive. We're called the Hadley Foundation. Dennis Hadley was the creator of the Nazareth House, the original Nazareth House, in 1979. We currently have 4 buildings. We have, and we're all in one block radius in downtown Montreal. And to give you an idea of what the area is like, we have beautiful gray stones that are over $1 million, and we have a needle park on the next street. What we do is we provide housing with support in these 4 different locations. We have an apartment building for women. We have a residence for young men. We have a main building with full services for men who are very vulnerable. And we're just in the process of our next renovation and our next building. And what it looks like with the demographics in the city of Montreal, this will also be for young men. Our intention today is to elaborate on our model of housing with support, with particular focus on the Next Step program. Our model is to provide a safe space for people to grow to the best of their ability, to gain autonomy to the best of their ability. We are not transitional. We found it was really too stressful for somebody to come in and we would say, well, you've got three months to get your life together. We don't work that way. You come in, and the first thing is we all know what people need. I can honestly say I have met over 500 women and the questions are the same. Do I have my own bathroom? Do I have a door I can lock? So this is where we start, just with the basics: safety, warmth, privacy. And then we throw in a few other things. We've got dogs and cats and music and students and meals, and we've created this home environment. And we see our residents every single day, which is a huge factor, which I'll bring up a little bit later. This is one of our men's residences. The clients generally arrive from hospital settings or they arrive from the shelter systems. We work in tandem with a lot of the healthcare teams in Montreal. Sorry about that. I've been talking a lot today. And we work in tandem, and it's really very, very collaborative. So one of the programs we're working on now with the Old Brewery Mission, well, thank you, is really an upstream approach. Somebody who's incarcerated but needs to, will be leaving prison, they can do their parole. The young people can do their parole with us. We can set this up because we all know that prison is right away a funnel to the streets. So we're open from 8 in the morning till 6 at night. Full services. We have peer support in the evening, caseworkers during the day, and because of our process of how people enter the houses, it's secure enough that you can use a peer support and an on-call for the evenings. And this also encourages self-autonomy. But a large part of our work is following the path of the client to see what they're interested in, who they want to connect with, who they consider their family. So the caseworkers, the intervention workers just follow along in this process. And we provide, and this is a word we've been hearing, of course, is wraparound support. So who are our residents? Parents, refugees, we have engineers, triathletes. The editor of the Gazette was in. I heard a resident speaking an Asian dialect to another resident. And I said, how did you ever learn the language? And he said he'd been a Cirque du Soleil trapeze artist for 2 years in China. So we bring this kind of thing back and go, there's no us and them. 1 in 4. So all our residents have a story. And we see very complex individuals. Bipolar, schizoaffective. It was very interesting to hear about the hoarding and the addiction, because this is our client base too. Borderline personality disorder, but everybody has trauma. And our wait lists, of course, like everybody else's, are growing. But because we see our residents every day, we have reduced hospitalizations 90%. The escalation is seen immediately, and then the teams can step in, like the ACT team that was mentioned. So we can support our residents to avoid hospitalization, which is not just a very compassionate model, it's much more cost-effective. So who pays? The average cost to the taxpayer in Montreal for one unhoused person is $60,000. This can swing up to $300,000. Our cost is $15,000 per individual. About 85% of this comes from trying, and I'm sure some of you do this as well, funding proposals, foundations, donors. I mean, it can go from a bake sale all the way up to a grand opening where you're inviting everybody that you know. But it's constant fundraising to support our client base, and that is the weight of my job. So we're very fortunate to have Jennifer Willard here, who's Manager of Client Services, and Eric Feliciano, who's our Uber intervention worker who runs the Next Step program, and they're going to elaborate a little bit more on the program. We have a big fat copy here, and people, we hope you'll have a look at it. We can have it in French or English. Thank you, and here's Jennifer.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Willard, and my role at Hadley Foundation is Manager of Client Services. Between our 4 homes and soon-to-be 60 residents, I develop connections with community organizations, hospitals, and healthcare teams throughout Montreal. These partners provide referrals for our new residents. For the past 8 years, I've been fortunate to work alongside amazing workers and as well courageous residents. I've been able to see the benefits of our housing model and the positive changes each resident goes through once they arrive at Hadley Foundation. Our homes are designed to provide each resident with security and belonging. Social activities like the Next Step program provide a non-judgmental space which helps break barriers and encourage our residents to be less isolated. Whether it be someone who would like to take the next step to secure future housing or individuals who are curious to learn from the planned activities, all residents are welcomed and encouraged to participate. Now I would like to take some time to discuss the Next Step program, designed in 2019. The Next Step program was initially funded by Hockey Helps the Homeless. As some of you may be aware, this foundation, through the love of hockey, raises funds for solution-based local homeless agencies. I'm sure there's many in the crowd right now who has received their funding. I've seen the animation of the Next Step program and how it's been thoroughly developed. There are 4 phases of the program, a step-by-step guide that transitions a person from contemplation to executing and finding housing. The first phase is an introduction to the Next Step program, which includes individuals who are inquiring about the program, filling out interest forms and commitments as well. The Next Step program facilitator reviews each individual's housing history, their activities of daily living, abilities in areas that need development, mental health, and physical health history. This initial phase also evaluates the timeline in which the individual is looking to take the next step in securing housing. There's no rapidity to finding other housing. They can do it at their own terms. The second phase is development and maintenance of competencies, skills, resources necessary for independent living. This section has always allowed for flexibility and possibility to introduce new ideas and programs. The goal is to always foster a learning experience for our residents, develop new skills, and create a stronger foundation to being autonomous. When Hadley Foundation students return to in-person internships after a long pandemic, the vast educational programs enriched the second phase of the Next Step program. The Hadley Foundation, primarily located downtown Montreal, allows for proximity to major universities and CEGEPs. McGill, Concordia, and Dawson are some of the schools that allow for us to take on students and enrich our community programs that are offered to the residents. We expanded the second phase to include sections from medicine, dentistry, nutrition, art, and social services. The goal of the second phase is to address residents' current health maintenance, self-care techniques, coping skills, and medication management.
With guidance and support, residents take on more responsibility in maintaining food preparation, nutrition, housekeeping, laundry, finances, and budgeting. The third phase consists of actualization and transitioning into the apartment. This phase includes the steps of finding an apartment, knowing your tenant's rights, understanding the expectations of a landlord, and visiting our housing board website. In Montreal, it's the Tribunal Administratif Logement. Preparing the timeline for the move and building community resources in the individual's neighborhood is important. Additionally, this section has explored further the capacities of living with a roommate. Oftentimes, our residents have developed a tolerance for living in a shared space, which helps foster patience when living with a roommate. The benefits of living with a roommate can be cost-effective and reduce isolation for our residents. The fourth and final phase is the external support. This stage allows our workers to provide external follow-up in the community for a period of 6 to 9 months. This time is devoted to encourage the individual to build their new daily routine, venture out to search for employment, return to school, or volunteer. The worker and individual determine together if an extension is needed for external follow-up. We noticed during the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is that there are more needs presenting. We have seen an increase in mental health distress and an increase in drug and alcohol consumption as a way to self-medicate. This leads individuals also to lose their employment and trigger onset of mental illness among young adults. More individuals find themselves in precarious housing situations resulting from the increase in rent, cost of food, and rent evictions. Simply put, Montreal is no longer affordable to live in, and we are living in a housing crisis. A statement echoed throughout Canada. A revision of the program was needed to reflect these changes. Lastly, the Next Step program has now been adapted and is used for the intake of new residents, more specifically at Anne's House, which provides social housing, 1.5 studio apartments for women who are semi-autonomous. We realized that the very program that helped residents take the next step could be an integral part in a new resident's transition into Anne's House. Implementing the Next Step program during intake provides an opportunity for our staff to understand the interests of a new resident, their capacities, strengths, and weaknesses, and allows us to navigate each resident in their new apartment and surrounding neighborhood. Although with the integration we have provided a resource guide that also allows for each new resident to know what is around Hadley Foundation. It gives me great pleasure also to introduce my colleague, Eric Feliciano. He's an intervention worker who will talk about some of his experiences running the program.
You guys hear me? Yeah, okay. So finally, it's my turn. You know what it's like sitting at the end of the table waiting for everybody to talk? Your heart's like racing and stuff. So anyways, so forgive me if I falter from time to time. It's been a long day, I know, for everybody. I realize that I'm probably, no, I think I'm the last presenter for you guys today. So I'll try to live up to everybody you've heard and to the panel here. Thank you, Jen and Sheila. They provided a really good scope of what the program is. And thank you, Christina and Nick, for the presentations. It's very informative. Stuff like a lot of numbers that I didn't know existed. So really happy about that. So yeah, again, my name is Eric Feliciano. I'm going to read at you, by the way, for about 6 to 7 minutes, and then we're free to go for refreshments and all that. So, so again, my name is Eric Feliciano. I'm one of the intervention workers with the Hadley Foundation, and I work predominantly with the male residents at both the main house, formerly known as Nazareth House, and John's House. This is where I conduct the Next Step program on a weekly basis. So today I'm here to talk to you about the practical, hands-on nature and aspects of the program. I'll begin by saying that it's been a really humbling experience for me. I've been facilitating the program for close to 2 years, and it's never without its surprises. The resource book itself for the Next Step program is an extremely well put together document consisting of information, guides, resources, and exercises, all geared toward helping one achieve the next step of obtaining more autonomous living. That said, I learned very quickly that as complete as a program can be, there's always the human aspect to consider, as I think a lot of you realize in your work as well. For example, in one of my earliest sessions with our residents, I was met with concerns that we were indeed prepping them to move sooner than later, therefore asking them to leave the Hadley Foundation. You see, some of our residents are older and in a lot of ways settled within our community, not expecting to move. So as a result, I had to adjust my approach and emphasize the life skills components of the program because the skill sets that our residents receive from the Next Step not only helps them to find more autonomous living, but also assists them with maintaining what they already have. So keeping a clean place, knowing how to prepare certain foods, remaining organized, maintaining a routine, budgeting, these are only a handful of things, as you all know, that an individual needs to oversee to have a good quality of life. And in the end, that's what it comes down to. We want our residents to live the best life they can, whether it's with us or on their own. So it's in this way that the program has evolved. With a humanistic approach, we not only teach our residents much needed skills, but lend an ear to what their concerns and fears are surrounding being on their own or fending for themselves. We try to normalize their experiences and struggles, especially since many of our residents struggle with various mental health issues, addictions, isolation. They may have a history of homelessness. And we understand that it can be easy to fall back into old or unhealthy patterns or habits. So as such, the Next Step is not just about learning skills. It's a safe space for our residents to share with each other and to voice what's on their minds. As we always say, the Hadley Foundation is not a boarding house, it's a home. So it's a community that supports each other and learns together. Just to give you, I have a few stories here. So a story about everybody coming together in particular and about the program being a safe space. The Hadley Foundation, unfortunately is located in an area that isn't always the safest. I recall about a year and a half ago when there was actually a shooting in the alleyway behind the main house. It was between a person and a police officer, and obviously a lot of our residents were very scared about that. So we addressed it right away. But in the Next Step program, I took the opportunity to address that situation with them to see how they feel. I asked the obvious questions related to Next Step and skill sets. How do you call it? Life skills. Who do you know? Do you know who to contact in case of an emergency? Do you know who's in charge in the house to call the police and so on and so forth? But it gave them a place to speak to one another, and I think it strengthened the bonds with the staff as well as amongst each other. And now they felt more able to rely on each other if anything else were to arise. It was heartwarming to see how they engaged in the session with each other, which also brings me to my next point and a more lighthearted story, the importance of engagement. So they were really engaged in that session. Actually, they're engaged in every session. But anyways, they were really engaged in that session. But just an example, I remember giving a session where it was mostly the younger individuals from John's house between 20 and 35. And I don't know, maybe some of you can attest to this, but speaking to younger individuals kind of like pulling teeth sometimes, just staring at blank faces. So I knew that a lot of them were sports fans. So what I would do in this particular session, I had a series of questions that I would ask them. But after asking a program question, I'd immediately follow up with who's your favorite boxer, who's going to win the Stanley Cup this year, who's the greatest of all time. So, it kept the flow going, it kept the energy going. I got a few chuckles, and it just let us have the session with ease. As for someone successfully finding autonomous lodging, one of our residents, who I'll call Mike, and who's been with us for about 5 years, originally presented as very rigid and uncompromising. He had a difficult time doing the simplest tasks and did not have a large margin for adaptability. For example, a former worker had accompanied Mike on 3 occasions to a place that Mike frequented regularly. It wasn't a complicated trip. It was a standard A to B situation. However, upon going on his own, Mike got completely lost, despite it being an A to B situation. But if you fast forward to today, hold on, I lost my marker now. Okay, yeah. Fast forward to today, Mike, he lives more, he still uses some of our services, but is living more independently apart from the community. He does his own banking now, and as opposed to being strict about going to his own branch, he's now more flexible and can go to any branch. He now knows how to do laundry and maintains a clean and organized space. Basically, he's come a long way for what he came with. This was also made possible through the existence of our service package. So it's a program through which someone who no longer lives in one of our residences may still receive certain services such as meals, medication distribution, and overall support. So we've seen it as a bridge between supportive housing and autonomous living or more autonomous living, and it's helped a lot of our residents a great deal. And we kind of always link all these programs we have a lot to the Next Step program because our bottom line is helping to create or revive that autonomy amongst our residents. So basically all these stories are examples of progress. Finding affordable and autonomous housing seemingly is always the top goal, but getting people to engage who otherwise would not have participated, finding connection and strength from the community you're a part of, these are also valuable. All to say that they're all success stories and an important reminder that every step taken, big or small, is significant. Additionally, it's also important to note that many of our residents may have lived a more institutionalized life before coming to Hadley Foundation. As Sheila had mentioned before, we might have people coming out of the prison system or maybe they might have, the mental health system and whatnot. So as such, they may have lost many of their autonomous abilities and capabilities, especially for vital decision making. Therefore, regaining these abilities has proven very frustrating for many. But through the Next Step program, we've been able to provide a safe and non-judgmental space to work on developing or redeveloping these skills. So to conclude, personally, I've come to develop what have become my own pillars for the Next Step program. That would be community, safe space, and engagement. These have helped me to lead successful sessions with our residents. We all learn together and have fun, and we look forward to the sessions and the planned activities. Even outside of the sessions, we still discuss what's covered because we see them every day, and every activity we do with them, every meal we have with them is always an opportunity to explore what they've learned during these sessions. So in the end, the Next Step has become more than just a program. It's a standard and a philosophy that exemplifies the culture of the Hanley Foundation, essentially helping our residents, which is what matters most. So thank you again. We welcome any questions. We'll answer in French or English, whichever you prefer. Thank you.
Thank you to all our presenters for sharing their insights from their research and practice. So we now have time for a Q&A period. We have about 30 minutes for that. There is a mic in the center of the room here if you'd like to line up and ask your questions to the presenters.
I don't think I need a mic. So I oversee a supportive housing program in Ontario, and I'm interested in your average stay because we started out with no limit, and then because we're so limited in our district on supportive housing units, we had 20. We were creating a bottleneck, so we went to 2 years less a day. However, we don't, if there's no housing available for them, we keep them then on a month to month. So I'm just interested in what your average stay is.
I can answer that. Okay. The way that we work is with a service agreement. We do not have leases. So the service agreement can be renewed yearly, but it's also discussed. It's an opportunity for somebody to move to other housing if they want. They can stay another year. It really depends. It's a relationship that's built with the workers, and with we don't use the word tenant. We say resident. And it's really the way that we work. It's on as-need basis, and it's individualized because not one size fits all. And we also find, especially when the women come into the housing, they sleep. They sleep for the first 3 weeks solid. They take a little bit longer to get going, and when they do, the ladies move on a little bit faster. But they just need that kind of period, so it's really on a, it's really, I'm sorry I can't answer.
Oh, so you don't have an average?
We don't have, not really, we don't have an average. The young people, Jennifer's in John's house, and we find the young people move out much quicker. They might be a year. The older men don't move as quickly. And then we have to deal with the other side of the issue where people are getting a little bit older and need more services, so we have to set that up. It really depends on the individual. Thank you.
What I can say is we do have an individual who has lived with us for over 30 years. And then we also have individuals who have lived at Anne's house since the start, so 2015, 8 years. There's a strong increase in going back to employment at Anne's house, so having a stable apartment allows them to move forward with their goals. Going back to school is very important to the ladies. And unlike Ontario, our social housing starts at 25% of their revenue, so they do save a little bit more money, and they really catch up on not depending completely on like social assistance.
Could I add a little something to that? I think probably similarly to as you're doing, it's really case by case. As we all say, I think that's the rhetoric, right? But I think by default, technically minimum a year because the service contract is 1 year at a time. So in that sense, yeah, it would be minimum a year. But as they mentioned, some people have been there for a while, some people leave earlier. I think depending on if they move on to another form of housing or more autonomous housing, if we're keeping ties with the resident and maybe in the future they might need something, we just reevaluate again and see how it goes. Yeah.
For those who have questions, if I could ask you to come to the mic, I believe that's important for those who are joining online to be able to hear the question. I don't know if they can hear it if it's not coming through the mic, so thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Beth. I'm from Boyle Street in Edmonton. I have a couple questions for the Hadley Foundation. At the beginning, you were talking about peer support, and they are the ones that oversee the program in the evenings. Are those people residents or former residents?
They're residents.
They are residents, and is that like a something that you kind of work with them as soon as they move in, is to start taking on more responsibilities, or is there like a process to that?
Some people will never be a peer support, and some people will. And so what we have is, because the team leave at about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, there's an on-call phone, and the peer support in each of the residences has a number to call the on-call phone. So that's the security that we have when the staff is not there.
And then my other question is later on, and I'm sorry, I forget your name.
Eric.
No, sorry, the one next to you.
Jennifer,
Yes.
sorry.
You were talking about how you were exploring roommates when people move on, and I'm wondering, are these people that have also been in the program that they live together? Is that common? And what's the success rate of when they have roommates?
So, yes, exactly. Sheila's, it's really turned for the roommate situation. For the men's residents, it's kind of like a group home setting versus Anne's house where it's studio apartments. And so they're learning these techniques on how to live with one another, how to navigate going to the bathroom or shower times and living rooms and respecting each other's privacy. So these techniques are learned in their living with us. And when they're looking at moving forward, we all know the cost of an apartment is ridiculous. Their social assistance is only going to go so far, or if they're getting employment, maybe they're not working full-time and can't afford that. So roommate situations kind of come up, and they already know techniques on how to work around each other and use spaces responsibly and together. So we haven't had, there's always talks that the residents are going to move out together. So they have developed strong friendships, relationships. We've had a cohort where 3 people had moved out in an apartment on their own in a different community organization. So there is a little bit of history of that, but it's not a concurrent thing that's going on. In terms of success rate, I don't have a number for you when it comes to that, but we do know that our residents are looking more for roommate situations because it allows them to have their peer support, less isolation, and that capacity to be a little bit more independent. Yeah.
Hi, I just have 2 questions. The first is for the last group of presenters, and it may be something you mentioned and I had missed it, but I'm just curious if for your supportive housing, if there's a requirement for like sobriety or recovery, or if folks who are living in the supportive housing, if some of them use substances or what that looks like there.
That's interesting because we have a harm reduction model. We have people who they will relapse, and that's going to be expected. Part of the thing that we do, and Jennifer could answer, I'm sure, is that we're in collaboration with other organizations. So we'll get a recommendation, let's say, from Dunham House, where somebody's already been for 6 months. This is very encouraged because they've gone through all those programs, and it gives them a better footing to be able to successfully come into Anne's house or any of the other residences. It's not all, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I can say generally it really works really well that people can maintain their sobriety.
Yeah. So I'll just add to that. So there is the recovery model where individuals have completed rehabilitation centers. We do ask for a 6-month sobriety before coming into our housing program. Someone who has active addictions and is currently using, we do not, we wouldn't accept a client in that profile, mainly because it's very disruptive for the house and it could impact or trigger other residents. Also, with the neighborhood around us, we do not want dealing or other things like that to come into our home program, so it's really the matter of safety. If we've seen someone who, and I think one of the presentations, that first month is almost very critical when someone comes out of a rehab, when they're in a structured, stable environment, to more options and capacities. So if they've been living with us for a little while, we have that capacity to know where their strengths are, get them connected again with their coping mechanisms and resources around them. So if we can manage relapse if their goal is still to be in a sober environment and if they want to continue with that. So if we're both on the same path, then it's working. If their goal is to go back to consumption or it's overriding all of their capacities to make decisions, then we would suggest other resources for them because it's just too complex for our needs.
Okay, thank you. My other question is for any of the folks who presented today. Just for context, I work in a Housing First program where most of our clients move into like private, like independent housing. And at least in my experience, what I've seen is like the #1 cause for eviction and whatnot has been related to guest management. I'm just curious if any of you have either researched or used or experienced strategies that have helped with that guest management, since I have noticed that is like a pretty big, and I'm seeing some nods. Yeah.
In the research, so just to validate, we now talked with over 150 providers, and they also say the same. It is one of the most challenging aspects of their job. It interacts with the support model, the housing model, and so what works for one provider and in one program may not work with another. Related to guest management, I think some of the challenges that come with drug selling is not the actual activity of exchanging drugs. It's the individuals that come over that then might be disruptive to others in the building, and that becomes the threat. And I think, to the principles of housing first, it's about having a conversation with that person and letting them know transparently, this does potentially put your housing at risk. And here's how we can support. But if at the end of the day, it's about that autonomy building capacity, and there is ownership for the tenant. There are some other programs that, because they use service agreements or they would have subleases, they can take immediate actions. That seem to be not the case in Housing First, and that was a challenge that we heard from a lot of providers, where they wanted to do something, but it's a challenge. The other related issue is just recognizing that there's potentially a moral dilemma for the Housing First tenant as well, because even though that might be an unwanted guest, that might be a close friend or family member from the time that they're homeless. And so one of the ways that we thought was quite promising is, when that happens, can the Housing First program provide housing supports to that unwanted guest as well? So can that program take that individual onto their caseload and now support that individual as a way of potentially protecting that tenant's, their client's tenancy, while adding, another individual who also needs that. So that's be my 2 cents.
I just had a quick question for the last group. Do you guys charge rent, or how does that work? Because you'd said you guys use service agreements, not leases. So what does the funding aspect and payment look like?
Okay, so just for 2 distinct purposes. So the male residents, we have 3 homes, which is group home style, has 3 meals a day provided, medication supervision, activities, and all that. It comes with a total of $780 for payment. So social assistance can vary in 3 levels in Montreal. You can have the basic amount, which is $760. Then you can have temporary limitations, where you might be dealing with a possibility of not being able to go back to work or other things like that, and that's around the $920 range, and then $1,100. If you've been on social assistance or social solidarity for 5 years, you've reached probably $1,500, which is more of the maximum amount. Of course, individuals who are at the very basic, I've already told you, they're getting $760. They can't pay the full amount, and we do try to offer a small subsidy to allow for them to either go back to work or to get their social assistance higher. So they could range for maybe $550 to $650 for payment of rent. For the women, they pay 25% of their social assistance or their employment. They have to have a revenue less than $38,000 a year, which was newly revised. So let's say they pay a rent of $200 or $250. Our social housing program, l'Office Municipal Habitation Montréal, will pay the remaining amount of the $688 rent. So it's very affordable for them, but they don't get all of the other extra services, and they have a level of autonomy where they can manage their own medication, make their own meals, but with support, of course.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Also, just they're furnished. Like, just to
Yes.
let you know, like that's included as well. So meals, furnished, activities, support,
Wi-Fi.
all of that.
This is one of the
Wi-Fi.
first questions.
It's also downtown. I know I said like it's not the best area at times. It's really weird actually. Like that area is it's like a 2 to 3 block radius where just it's rock and roll for some reason. But we're not far from business centers and cultural centers and all that. So it's actually also an ideal spot, so to speak, for people in general. Like so.
Public transit.
So all that,
Grocery stores.
all that put together kind of adds to the value of it. So,
Thank you.
no problem.
I just had a question for Dr. Mutchler. So my question is, so there are a lot of problems in rural context, obviously distances, time, and you mentioned kind of the small town effect of everyone knowing everybody's business. Do you have a sense of some opportunities in rural context, in the sense of sometimes coordinating different community players is more straightforward. In smaller places, you can get volunteerism, those kind of elements, and things like social impact bonds and stuff like that tends to make more sense in constrained environments. But just any thoughts on, aside from the problems, are there things that can be leveraged in rural contexts that could be useful in this frame?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought I was gonna get by without a question. So then you give me a hard one here. I think, one thing that comes to mind is just the study that I presented on was done like pre-COVID. So I think one thing that has come out of COVID is our ability to have access to a lot of communities online. So, if you are experiencing this stigma and discrimination maybe in your community, there's access to a lot of different community services now, like, for example, whether that's, in our study in Moncton, or being able to join an online community in Toronto. I think there's a lot more that can be done in that space. And at the same time, I think that community level interventions are still needed to help folks transition back into the community. So like assisting, providing more education to communities on what's being done, and how maybe local organizations, like I think the farm example was a great one, where you had somebody who started working on a local farm, right? And that could be a community level intervention where, that farmer gets to know that person, and that stigma is reduced that person's experiencing. So if you could leverage like local businesses to have folks come in as staff or volunteers to see that, there is more to this person or these people than these maybe difficult interactions I've had with them in the past. That would be my two-part answer. Thanks for your question.
Any further questions?
Hi, I have a question just related to barriers and risk management that you were discussing. Just for some brief context, I'm here from Yellowknife, and we run a Housing First for Adults program. And our landlord that we work with is Northview, and they own approximately 70% of all private market rentals in the city. So a lot of the barriers that you mentioned, like landlord tolerance and wanting to get out of the program, are things that we're facing. And so we are considering moving from like from a scattered site model to a single site model where we own the building. And so I'm just wondering if that has come up in, any of your research, and how you might think that would benefit, also balancing with the fact that then the organization becomes the landlord and there are challenges associated with that.
I have lots to say. Keep this concise here. You're certainly not the only one. We've heard a lot about not so much transitioning a program in place from scattered site to single site, but certainly more pursuit of single site opportunities given the challenges of the loss of units that is happening. It absolutely changes the model and the experience, tenants' experiences in the program, and the way that risk management ultimately happens. It presents some benefits, and it also presents some drawbacks. I think what you highlight is really about how do you make it sustainable for existing tenants and future ones, and that's a really critical consideration. I think at the end of the day, if the landlord pulls back, well, now there's no scattered site housing first. I think in terms of the evidence for housing first, certainly there is very strong evidence that the scattered site model and single site model can be done with similar efficacy. There are unique elements to wearing that hat, but there are also ways that programs can accommodate that by having separate divisions that take on the housing piece, that take on the support piece, so that it's not a singular caseworker that says, today I'm wearing a landlord hat, tomorrow I'm wearing my harm reduction hat with you, and having to have tenants sort that out. So unfortunately, I don't have a simple recommendation from that, only that that is something that other providers are talking about, and some are talking about dedicated housing managers that liaise directly with Northview, that have regular check-ins with Northview, so that when they have a problem, they come to somebody, and that person is usually a manager or a director that will work to address that issue, really for risk management to the program, to the organization, as opposed to any individual tenant.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A period. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful presenters. This was an excellent session.